Hello everyone, my name is Dan. Welcome to Book Soup. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight's program is with John Ibson. He's here for his new book, Men Without Maps, Some Gay Males of a Generation Before Stonewall. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please put your cell phones on silent or vibrate during the presentation. If you've not yet purchased the book and you would like to, we have books available for purchase at the front register. A purchase tonight keeps our doors open and is greatly appreciated by real human beings, and it also supports this great author, so thank you for that. While you're at the register, please consider joining our email list. We have great events almost every night of the week, so really active events program here at the store. And now a few words about John. John Ibson is Emeritus Professor of American Studies at California State University, Fullerton, and the author of The Morning After and Picturing Men. Both books were published by the University of Chicago Press. Please join me in welcoming John Ibson.
Very much. It's been a while since I've seen my name on the towel dispenser in the men's room, but it was kind of it made me feel right at home to see that. It's also very nice to see that I'm not related to everyone who's here in the audience. That's also not, to most of the people, but not everybody. So that's a special welcome to the non-relatives. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about my book and mostly do some reading from it, and then I will be happy to have any questions that you might have. I understand that my nephew who's here and his husband were interrogating my husband about why in the world I was driving a Volkswagen convertible, and I want to start by explaining that. I love symmetry. And when I began teaching at Cal State Fullerton nearly a half century ago, I bought my first new car. My dad had to co-sign for the loan. And I'm about to retire now. And as a lover of symmetry, I recently purchased a 2019 model of the same car that I bought new in 1972. It was a Volkswagen convertible. Now, as my students often, you might be wondering, what in the hell is he telling us this for? Is this another one of his stories? There's actually some. This is relevant that I bought a Volkswagen convertible now because I like symmetry, but especially why did I buy one in 1972? I bought one in 1972 because Donald, the character Donald, a handsome and otherwise appealing character in the 1970 film The Boys in the Band, which was the first, or at least certainly one of the first, to deal with unambiguously gay male characters, at least to a certain extent in a sympathetic way. And Donald was one of the characters in The Boys in the Band that I had occasion to see in Boston in 1970. And Donald, in the opening, you can Google the trailer for The Boys in the Band, and you'll find that in the trailer as well as in the movie, Donald is seen driving a Volkswagen convertible, an orange one, in fact. And I bought myself an orange one. The goofy thing is, or it seems goofy, that I knew then, as I still know today, I bought that Volkswagen convertible because a guy that I saw for less than 30 seconds in a movie was driving that car. There were so few representations available of at least somewhat positive gay male characters in the popular culture. There were such poorly developed maps, as I describe them, that my choice in automobiles was determined by this fictional character who was only on the screen for a very few minutes. So that is, in a nutshell, what my book is about. My husband would probably tell me that, well, okay, you can shut up now, you kind of made the point, but let me elaborate a little bit more, if I could, about this idea of men without maps. And we can, by all means, if you want to, as I'm reading, if you want to, for one thing, it'll break up the tedium of the reading. If you have something that you really want to ask about, or don't hesitate to, you're not going to throw me off if you interrupt. You don't have to wait until I'm done with reading. Anyway, let me just read a little bit about this, what I call the maps metaphor. Where do I get this idea of men without maps? Of the Bible's many problematic proclamations, few are as wrong-headed as the insistence in Ecclesiastes 1:9 that what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Indeed, today it seems that virtually every sunrise illuminates something somewhere vastly different than its predecessor of the day before. When the biblical passage was composed, of course, human life was hugely more stable in its structural arrangements and cultural meanings. Not only day by day, but from decade to decade, even century to century, than has been the case in much of the world since the Industrial Revolution. But as much as modern history chronicles change, it also records substantial continuity and fierce resistance to change. Helping ensure continuity is cultural transmission from one generation to the next, a crucial way that humans learn what to think and do, how to be in the world, in part from various modeling figures throughout their lives. As one of the erudite monkeys observes in Planet of the Apes, humans see, humans do. The absence or avoidance of such behavioral models and other sources of cultural information can itself produce significant change, requiring imagination, resourcefulness, even courage, as people more or less on their own move outside previous paradigms of thought and action. Men Without Maps is a book about a large number of American men in the middle decades of the 20th century who displayed an abundance of courage and creativity as they constructed lives and an identity for themselves that acknowledged their sexual attraction to other males, and did so without having had precious little affirmative modeling or guidance of any sort, instead mostly encountering scorn from the society in which they had come of age. This is a book about men who lived largely without, or for whom there was little direct resonance within, the cultural maps that were provided in such conspicuous ubiquity through the first half of the 20th century to males and females sexually attracted to each other. These maps for men and women were guides provided by their own parents, by powerful social institutions such as the medical profession, schools, and churches, in countless works of fiction and nonfiction alike, and by virtually every agent of popular culture in music, the movies, and advertisements on the radio, and eventually by the early situation comedies on television. Pervasively, American culture throughout the 20th century's first half had been no less than basic training for life as a heterosexual. The maps for that were all over the place, free for the asking, and were provided, forcefully at times, even to those for whom they were wholly inappropriate. This book's very title, with its map metaphor, requires some qualification, best noted here at the outset. Regardless of the direction of one's desire, so powerful was the cultural emphasis on heterosexuality during the first half and more of the 20th century that few could escape it, leaving the men in this book not exactly without maps, but largely without guidance that took into account to say anything of honoring or encouraging their particular needs and yearnings. One might better speak of relative maplessness, cumbersome as that term might be, or might meaningfully point to negative maps provided by those who denounced queerness, the clandestine maps available in certain queer spaces, or the surreptitious maps provided by such sources as men's bodybuilding magazines or pen pal clubs. Not merely an author's liking for alliteration has inspired this book's title. The heterosexual hegemony during the period encompassed by this book makes this title apt. When it came to maps of their own, openly distributed and consulted, gay men mostly went without until the 1970s or later. My focus is on gay males in the United States of the, quote, generation before Stonewall. Men who put together their lives and their sense of self during the last century or so of tremendous cultural ferment, accelerating modernization, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the early Cold War, that took place before the burgeoning of the gay rights movement across the country in the late 1960s and the 1970s. The men in this book lived at a time when an individual's very identity, sexually speaking, in a society increasingly focused on sex, had largely come to be determined externally by the sex of those with whom the individual desired to have sexual involvement. The implications of that identity for heterosexuals were a matter of endless public discourse. But for homosexuals, the implications were mostly a matter of secrecy, silence, speculation, or shame. To be sure, life for gay men in America did not suddenly become a bed of roses from the 1970s onward, but the role models and cultural information available to them did increase greatly during that later time. The relative absence of information and models that I'm calling maps for men attracted to each other should not be confused with a lack of opportunity for sexual contact between persons of the same sex. Such opportunities to have sex, of course, have existed throughout human history and were in no short supply for men in the United States during the first half of the 20th century. But when an activity is scorned by a society's dominant culture, the activity typically must be furtive, accompanied by varying degrees of punishment, ridicule, guilt, secrecy, and shame. And for some, of course, also by the excitement of risk-taking, even by finding pleasure in misbehavior. How-to manuals, literal or figurative, are not provided except in indirect, inadvertent ways, typically as part of denunciations. Though historians have been properly skeptical in recent years about the actual impact of advice literature, a type of map, the content and availability of such literature on a particular topic is nonetheless important cultural evidence, an index of attitudes, if not of behavior. The complete absence of such literature, of any kind of guidebooks, which defines the mid-century situation for gay men, is revealing as well. David P. McWhirter and Andrew Mattinson's The Gay Couple, How Relationships Develop, the first work of its kind published in the United States, appeared in 1984 and has been followed by numerous similar works, to say nothing of the countless works on other queer topics in history, literature, and psychology that have appeared in recent decades. Not one book like The Male Couple was available, however. Indeed, such a book was unimaginable for the men who, without maps, of a slightly earlier generation. In individual instances, a more experienced relative, friend, or sexual partner might provide guidance or even become something of a model. But such was the force of antagonism against queerness in the country's dominant culture at the time, that mid-century queer males were often on their own in navigating their desire. Guidance might come from one's own neighbors, if a male were to live in one of the sections of a few large American cities in which gay men were comparatively welcome and numerous, areas that had been growing since the country's early years, one of the, quote, zones of gay camaraderie and security, so meticulously modeled for New York City by George Chauncey. Particular sites within those zones, restaurants, bars, apartment and boarding houses, parks and baths, became queer spaces, places where information and guidance about being gay was readily available. Of particular importance in New York City and elsewhere were certain YMCAs. In historian Chauncey's words, it was at the Y that many newcomers to the city made their first contacts with other gay men. For those who were unable or unwilling to move to or even visit someplace like New York's East 50s or 60s, Greenwich Village or Chelseaville, the sense of isolation could be profound. Service in World War II often offered men of various sexual inclinations a substantial release from constrictions of civilian life in the company of kindred spirits, but the culture of post-war America was freshly restrictive regarding men's intimacy of any sort. A cruel irony I recently explored in my book, The Morning After, Loss and Longing Among Mid-Century American Men. Being a leader or simply a member in the early homophile movement for gay and lesbian rights between the end of the war and the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969 was of course a valuable experience in mapmaking. But such activity was confined to relatively few American men who had sexual yearnings for other males. In those maps provided in such abundance to heterosexuals, there was an overwhelming emphasis on pairing off, with marriage and parenthood as the much preferred eventual result of the coupling, especially in the years immediately following the Second World War. Ever since Americans in the late 18th century had begun to leave their parents' farms in large numbers, lured to burgeoning cities by greater economic opportunity and often by freedom from the control of family, church, and local elites, however, the age-old imperative in agrarian societies to reproduce children as the cheapest source of farm labor lost its force altogether, as did the economic rationale for marriage to someone with whom one might produce the little future laborers. The migrants to America's cities were joined, beginning especially in the 19th century, by those leaving farms from as disparate places as Ireland and China, and by those leaving the shtetls of Eastern Europe or the rural poverty and bigotry of the post-slavery South. Of course, pairing off, marriage and reproduction, can for some people have benefits that outweigh their economic drawbacks in urban industrial settings. What's remarkable is that both pairing off and parenthood retained tremendous cultural power, as if most Americans were still living in the little house on the prairie, long after such ceased to be the case. Further, pairing off and parenting retained their popularity alongside numerous incidents of dysfunction, a too polite word for misery, even abuse, between spouses and between parents and children in modern America. So centered on coupling was American culture, and such were the satisfactions of keeping regular company with someone of one's own choosing, that pairing off not only had appeal for those who chose not to reproduce, but also might even appeal to those for whom reproduction together was biologically impossible, among them persons of the same sex. One might speak in this regard of borrowed maps that had at best indistinct details. In a process commonly seen as beginning only in the late 19th century, persons attracted to those of their own sex were given distinct and largely scorned identities as homosexuals in American culture. Homosexuality, or homosexual, a word not even coined, first in German until 1869, originally described only an activity, not a person. Even before, perhaps especially before, the birth of that identity in American culture, persons for whom reproduction was not a priority could pair off with a member of their own sex for a short while or a lifetime, or could at least dream of doing so. For some of these same-sex couples, mutual self-satisfaction was surely a part of the arrangement, while probably for others it was not. For young South Carolinians, James H. Hammond and Thomas Jefferson Withers later important figures in the American Confederacy, for instance, there had been exuberant sexual activity that apparently was so unburdened by guilt that Withers could write thusly in an 1826 letter to Hammond that recalled their frolicking together a few years earlier. I feel some inclination to learn, Withers wrote, whether you yet sleep in your shirt tail, and whether you have yet to have that extravagant delight of poking and punching a writhing bedfellow with your long fleshen pole, the exquisite touches of which I have often had the honor of feeling. No less a figure than the 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan, and the nation's 13th Vice President, William Rufus Devane King, lifelong bachelors both, lived together in Buchanan's house for 15 years when they were senators. The president's nieces destroyed the two men's correspondence after Buchanan's 1868 death, though an 1844 letter survived from when King had left to become the American ambassador to France. I'm now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me, Buchanan told King. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any one of them. Their living arrangement and its implications did not go unnoticed. But while Andrew Jackson, for instance, reportedly called Buchanan and King Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, the ridicule did not hamper either King's or Buchanan's rise to the top. In that era before the notion of a fixed sexual identity and the accompanying scorn heaped on homosexuals had become part of American culture. A towering figure in antebellum, that's pre-Civil War America, Daniel Webster, lived with his dear friend James Harvey Bingham when they were Dartmouth undergraduates. And though Webster eventually married, he wrote Bingham after their graduation about their living together again for good. We will yoke together again. Your little bed is just wide enough. We perhaps shall never be rich. No matter, we can supply our own personal necessities. By the time we are 30, we shall put on the dress of old bachelors, a morning suit, and having sown all our wild oats with a round hat and a hickory staff, we will march to the end of our life, whistling as merry as robins. Even if Webster was being wholly fanciful, the utterly unself-conscious tone of his comments is striking. The inherently sexual and transgressive connotations that would later accompany such a proposal were still a century or so away, in this era that Jonathan Ned Katz has amply termed before homosexuality. Now, my book is about the time after homosexuality, after Americans began thinking of themselves as having a distinct sexual identity that was either heterosexual or homosexual, or bisexual was a term that didn't really become commonplace until the 20th century as a sort of middle ground. So that long, I apologize for the length of that reading, however compelling my reading might be. It was a little tedious for me. I can only imagine what it was like for you. But I did want to lay out that this idea that I have of maps, that it's not as if people who yearned, males who yearned for members of their own sex were completely without guidance. No, they had it, but it was in spite of the culture they lived in, not because of it. They really lived between the lines of American culture until much later on. When I was in graduate school, as a way of avoiding working on my classes or working on my doctoral dissertation, we were such incredible nerds that we would amuse ourselves by reading the dedications that historians would make in their books. This is how hard up we were for amusement. But anyway, I became sort of a fan of reading the dedications that scholars, especially the people that I was modeling myself on in the profession, had made in their books. So when I've written books, it was important to me to whom I dedicated them. And the first book that I published, if you owned a copy of it, you would have a very rare piece of work. It's utterly and totally obscure. but I dedicated it nonetheless to my parents. It was the first piece of work that I did. And the second book the first real book that I consider a real book that I wrote, Dan was nice enough to mention, and that's Picturing Men. I dedicated that to my husband, to my husband Steve. And the book that I wrote previous to this, I dedicated to people who had some considerable experience in the middle years of the 20th century that I've written about. Both of whom are with us only in memory, and that's my sister Nancy and my brother Robert. That book is dedicated to them. So when it came time for this book, I mean, I take these things seriously. Well, who am I going to dedicate this book to? It seemed to me that it was relevant in a particular kind of way for me to dedicate this book to my fellow graduate students at Brandeis in over 50 years ago. And I just want to read a little something there, not to just indulge myself in this sort of personal recollection, but rather because in talking about to whom this book is dedicated, it makes a certain point about the book, I think. I was tremendously fortunate to receive my graduate training in a superb program, History of American Civilization at Brandeis, during an especially exciting time to both study and experience American history, the late 1960s and early 1970s. Only when I became a teacher myself would I fully realize how gifted and generous with their time my Brandeis professors were. But it was from a remarkable group of fellow graduate students and their dear ones that I learned the most about historical inquiry and about myself. In countless and spirited, and sometimes spirit-filled, conversations at the poker table, in bar rooms, in our apartments, over shared meals, and even on occasion while sitting outside the Brandeis Library. It's one of the great satisfactions of my life that some of these people have remained my friends, and it was a highlight of that life when several of us gathered in 2006 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of when most of us entered Brandeis, and again in 2016 to mark the half century that somehow had managed to pass. Like Bob Dylan's Mr. Jones, we knew something was happening in those years when we first met, even if we didn't exactly know what the something was. We assuredly knew that in part it had something to do with our wanting to study more than presidential administrations or other aspects of public life. And that, as my friend Carl Siracusa smartly put it back then, the Mount Everest theory of history is wrong. In other words, you don't study history for the same reason that people climb Mount Everest supposedly because it's there. You study history because it should have other importance. And that our work needed to be more purposeful. In 1966, I didn't dream that someday I'd be writing history like Men Without Maps. But even then, I did want my work to spring from deep within myself, to be more than an assigned task. Because for me, this book represents a modest fulfilling of my vague yearnings from those days. I gratefully dedicate Men Without Maps to, and I mentioned some of these people by name that were my fellow graduate students. There's some other individual that I want to mention that just because, and again, not to be self-indulgent, but because I think it figures in how different our times are from the times that these men that I've written about live. When I was back there at Brandeis 50 years ago, not only did I never dream that I would be writing history like this, I certainly never dreamed that I would be mentioning a man who would be my husband in a book. That wasn't on the agenda. There was no map for that in 1966. There were a few people, I later found out, who were even thinking then about same-sex marriage, but they never crossed my path, not then. So it was, this was not a part of my maps that I would be closing the acknowledgments in this book with this paragraph. I can easily enumerate the ways that this book is better because of the role that my husband, Steve Harrison, played in its creation. He listened to my evolving ideas with patience and uncommon good sense, asking questions that I may not always have welcomed, probably rarely welcomed, but nearly always benefited from. He listened to me read aloud countless passages that were either vexing or pleasing me, and then he read an entire draft, making copious comments on style and substance. Naming the ways that Steve has bettered my life over our 41 years together would also be easy, but that process would be virtually endless. So I'm not going to start enumerating those things, as much as he might be interested to hear what that list would be. Let me just tell you quickly something about the guys who show up in this book, and I'm very interested in, if anybody wants to bring it up, in discussing why this is a book about men without maps as opposed to men and women without maps. Why I'm concentrating on gay males. What sense does that make that I'm concentrating on gay males and not lesbians as well? But let me just read something, and I promise to keep this a little shorter than the other. When you plan for this, and I've done readings before, you never know exactly how long something's going to take. It was bothering me how long that first passage I read took, so if it was bothering you, I apologize. But anyway, let me just, so you'll get some sense of who this book is about, not just what it's about, the without maps idea. Let me just fairly briefly go over that. Men Without Maps has two parts. Part one considers male couples, men who shared a home, affection, and one assumed sex for a significant period in their adult lives. Although the number of coupled gay men by mid-century is unclear, what the authors of The Male Couple in 1984 called the old myth about gay men and their relationships had long denied the very existence of such coupled relationships. So miserable and isolating was the gay existence said to be, despite the shibboleth's insistence that misery loves company. Interestingly, in a 1947 letter to Gore Vidal, the writer Christopher Isherwood, who would later begin his 33-year coupling with artist Don Bacardi 6 years later, maintained that queer misery was a myth also, as was the notion that there were few durable gay male relationships. Homosexual relationships, wrote Isherwood, can be and frequently are happy. Many men live together for years and share their lives and their work, just as heterosexuals do. Part one of this book introduces several such relationships, suggesting that men who were part of these unions were the genuine outlaws, challenging popular notions about queer men and about men in general. Some couples are moderately well known today, like poet Robert Duncan and artist Jess Collins, or the influential mid-century modern furniture designer Edward J. Wormley, and the partner he had known since boyhood, college professor Edward Krauss. The Wormley-Krauss papers in the Human Sexuality collection of Cornell University's rare and manuscript collections fill 29 boxes, mostly comprised of the couple's extraordinary correspondence, at least weekly, sometimes daily, covering 22 years, from college until late middle age, before they finally realized their dream of living together under the same roof, to get thereafter only leaving each other little notes around their Connecticut home. Though the other couples in part one are not well known, their lives together are nonetheless documented by extensive written and photographic material held together either at Cornell or else in the Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Historical Society in San Francisco. The lives of these men were unremarkable, other than in the simple fact that they were led as part of a male couple, such as, for instance, Tom Rolfson and Chalmer Clemens, the solidly middle-class owners of a San Francisco printing business. Part two considers the lives of men whose mid-century existence was more solitary, though not necessarily more miserable or happier, because they lived alone. The solitary man, after all, is something of an American male archetype, mythic and occasionally real, allegedly living outside of society, unencumbered by its restraints, whether frontiersman, cowboy, motorcyclist, or superhero. With his purported ruggedness, this individual American male has usually been seen as possibly queer, only by the likes of certain professors, screenwriters, comic book reformers, and some queer men themselves, especially those who fancy leather garb and paraphernalia. There's little doubt about the queerness of the solitary men discussed in part 2 of this book, however, and my purpose in giving them a section of their own has been to explore how their lives might illuminate the state of both queerness and singleness in mid-century America. A few of these solitary men are well known, such as important modernist photographer Minor White, but most of them are not. Some of their lives are available to us, as with some of the men in couples, in material collected in the Human Sexuality Archives at Cornell, or the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Historical Society in San Francisco. These men who lived alone include Charles Schwab, a federal government chemist, Robert Leach, a college professor, and Berkeley electrician Bill Gaddis. One man, longtime Texas Christian University religion professor Ambrose Edens, a veteran of World War II who died in 2007 at age 86, left behind virtually no written clues to his life. No diaries or saved correspondence, although collectors of baseball memorabilia know Edens well because of his remarkable collectors of players' autographs, the proceeds from the sale of which Edens donated to his local church in Corsicana, Texas. But Ambrose Edens did leave behind 4 extraordinary albums of photographs that he took during his late adolescence through his years in graduate school at Vanderbilt. Albums sold later at an estate sale of his meager belongings that some Texas Christian University colleagues held after Edens died. These hundreds of extraordinary photographs, supplemented by my lengthy interviews with several of Ambrose Edens' former students and colleagues, tell an intriguing story indeed. For all of his seeming eccentricity, the life of Ambrose Edens reveals much about mid-century American life and makes, I believe, a fitting conclusion to Men Without Maps. And that is the conclusion of what I want to read in that book. I would much rather talk with you about the topic than read from it, but it was Dan's insistence that I do a reading, so I had to do that. But I would much rather chat with you about anything you wonder about, or what anything else about the book. If you're inquiring about the price, you can ask Dan. But yeah.
So how much
Robert.
is through interview and how much is through research?
That's a very good question. I would consider the interviews part of the research process too, but the almost yes, all of the interviews pertain to the one man who left nothing written behind, and that's nothing. He did leave some scholarly articles and things behind, but it left no personal papers behind of any kind. This guy Ambrose Edens. So I really want, in the way that research can work, just one thing led to another. Ancestry.com is like an incredible benefit to people doing not only their own genealogical research, but for historians too. And I found these guys, younger mostly than Ambrose Edens, at least by a little bit, former colleagues of his, a couple of former students of his, who are still living, and I was able to interview them. One of them in person because coincidentally he's a retired professor from the Claremont Graduate School, so he lives in our hometown in Claremont. But otherwise, they were long phone interviews, some of them very long phone interviews. But otherwise, it's all written materials. It's diaries, personal letters, and photographs that are held at really the two of the 3 best archives for LGBT materials, and that's the Human Sexuality Collection at Cornell and the Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Historical Society in San Francisco. The one archives here in LA has a lot of really important stuff. None of it really pertinent to what I was studying, so I didn't use it. I consulted their archives, but I didn't really use it. So most of the men, it's in the bibliography for the book. Most of the research was written material or photographs, the photograph albums that people. It's funny how in some of my earlier work that relied a lot on photographs, it was just amazing that I ended up even seeing these photographs because they weren't housed in some archives. They were curling in the hot sun at the swap meet, and because some man, some of my studies are on just men in general, not necessarily men that are identifiably gay, but when men of whatever orientation they might be died, there was no one around to keep their photographs, and they ended up, it was benefit to me. I got that stuff, but there's something so sad about some of these World War II photo albums that were so lovingly put together by these veterans of the war, and the damn things on eBay for $25, So I had, eBay was also another source, not so much for this book, more for other works of mine, mostly photographs, but also some written stuff, some letters and things that show up on, the damnedest things show up on eBay. Yes?
How did the AIDS epidemic have an effect on the history of gayness?
Well, that's really this book ends, before that. So it's, I would say it's something that I can speak about only from personal experience, from having lived through that period, not from having studied it in any great detail, at least not for any book that I was writing. In a course that I taught for many years on sexual orientations, we would certainly talk about the AIDS epidemic and what it, in a very sad way for the people who did not survive the AIDS epidemic, it did leave behind some extraordinary records, only one of which is the AIDS quilt, but there were many diaries and other writings from people who, either as caregivers or as people who were ill, left behind. And I think, this is just sort of freewheeling because it's not really something that I've thought about in great detail, but it gave a certain awful majesty to the gay experience, and just it would involve lesbians as well, and the assistance that they gave, and the straight person sometimes too. This is not only before Stonewall, but before AIDS, so it's a different. The horrible irony, mountains of irony about AIDS, but just when it seemed we were coming out of the darkness in the 70s, then, it's, of course, Pat Buchanan and some of those other conservatives that will spend eternity rotting in hell had their own explanations that it was, nature's retribution, but there was just some fundamental irony that AIDS came just as things seemed to be getting better. It was painful enough to write about this, but writing about but there's something incredibly reassuring about AIDS too, in terms of what the courage and the way in which people rose to the occasion. Before there was a bit of supply. Talk about no maps. There was when we had a president who couldn't even say the word. Bill Clinton was the first president that ever said gay. reference to sexual orientation. That is that young student with the dark shirt. Yes.
How did you choose the subjects you wrote about, and were there any couples that you decided not to include? I actually don't remember the
I don't
answer to
remember
this
that
question.
either.
So
This is the story of our life, isn't it?
yes, it is.
What, you know, it's either things we can't hear or things we don't remember. But no, there surely are other couples that could have been included, but every couple that I found at the Human Sexuality Collection at Cornell and the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco either made their way somehow or another into this book, if only in a couple of paragraphs. Some of them, like Krauss and Wormley, that had 29 boxes of their personal correspondence. I mean, I had a ton of stuff to say about it. So I didn't really leave anybody on the cutting room floor. I tried to make some mention of everybody on whom I found evidence.
Was there a box under assigned couples? I mean, how did you find them in the... There wasn't a box. There wasn't a sign that said couples. I just went through all the list. I mean, it's not like, you know me, I won't usually hold back if I think I have something to show off. But it's not like it was just this tremendous effort. There are only several dozen men whose records are housed at these places. So, this is there isn't anything quite like this book, if I do say so myself, but it's like part of a first chapter of the story that has yet to be told. Steve and I were at a gathering for some of our graduate students a couple of years ago when I was talking about this research, and one of my colleagues asked what might have been a sort of gotcha question about, well, what about men of color? Isn't this white men without masks? It is not. I mean, there is one man of color in the book, but it is mostly about white males, simply because I could only go where the evidence took me, and there's a lot of other evidence out there of about queer men of color in this time period, but it was not housed in those archives, and would have to be accessed in other kinds of ways. I have my own thoughts about how the experiences of queer men of color differed from the white males, the almost entirely white males that are in this book. But I'm certainly, with a kind of play, not a play on words, but kind of making a reference to Ralph Ellison's wonderful novel about a man of color, Invisible Man. I make the point in the preface to this book that there is an invisible man in this book, and it's the gay man of color. And I'm not unaware that indigenous men and Latinos and Asians and African Americans are not, as such, identified in this book. But race and ethnicity doesn't define everything there is about a person any more than sexuality does. And so I don't think this book is irrelevant to the experience of men of color, but it doesn't explicitly deal with it. Yeah.
Why did you decide to publish this book now? I mean, it could have come before Picturing Men. It could come after the next one, right? Why now?
I didn't have the material. I mean, it was really pretty much in sequence. I mean,
it kind of alludes to this in talking about when I was in graduate school. I never dreamed that I'd be writing about that. I was studying race and ethnicity. That's what I did my doctoral dissertation on. That's what I was interested in. And I didn't, nobody was doing, you know, there were a few people beginning the beginnings of what would have been called homosexual history back then, but nobody was going to let you get a PhD writing a dissertation on such a thing. So that didn't come to me until I had pretty much given up on scholarship, because my work on my doctoral dissertation wasn't exactly wildly and enthusiastically received by publishers. So I had pretty much decided, well, fuck those people. I'm going to just, I'll just be a teacher, and I'm pretty good at that, so I'll do that. And, you know, you never say never, and I was, you know, well into midlife when I started thinking about studying gender and sexuality and about the way men were represented in things. And I started collecting male imagery, everyday photographs about men together, just because Steve and I were in an antique store in Maine in 1995, and I, you know, out of those 6 photographs that I bought, grew a collection of over 10,000 now. But the price tag of which is a secret in our home. But that became Picturing Men. That was picturing, and that was about. That wasn't a, you know. Some people saw it as a LGBT book, and if people wanted to spend their money on it as an LGBT book, that was cool. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a book about men's relationships. You can't really tell from the kind of photographs I collected whether people had a sexual. I didn't collect those kind of photographs to know whether they had a sexual relationship, and simply because they had their arms around each other. On eBay, they get sold as gay images, but my point was intimacy, not sex. But anyway, that book came out. That's a very long-winded answer, I say. But so Picturing Men came out in 2002, and then I knew I wanted to write a book about the mid-century period, because Picturing Men, the photographs really changed after World War II. The way men posed together, and I began to think men's relationships in the years after World War II were very different. Not just men who were having sex with each other, but men's relationships in general, I thought, changed dramatically. So I began researching that, and I was writing, I didn't realize it, but I was researching 2 books at once. I was researching the rabbit to pull out of my hat. I was researching this, and I thought I was researching one book, because I was gathering material that became both of these, and I realized that I really had 2 books, that I had 2 books going, and my editor at the University of Chicago Press is a wonderful human being, a jazz drummer, tremendous lover of literature, and he's a great guy who just recently died. Douglas said, you know, you've got 2 books going here, and they're kind of working at cross purposes with each other. Why don't you write one first and then come up with the other one? So it was an evolution. That was how it worked. I mean, it wasn't. You don't really plan those things out. I mean, it's like, as Doug knows, I holler at people in my seminar about, don't be thinking about where your research is going to end up. Just get out there and do it and see where it takes you. And because you never know where it's going to go. So that was kind of how it. Anything else?
You alluded to 18th century or 19th century
Yeah.
people, and you said Webster. You
Yeah.
had mentioned Lincoln.
Yeah.
What have you found out? You know.
Yeah, my notion on Lincoln is, for one thing, Nick, you can say without qualification, Abraham Lincoln was not homosexual because he went to his grave before that word was even coined. Now, I'm not trying to just be cute with that answer, but it's true. That word was coined. The word homosexual was not coined in German. It was coined in German in 1869, and Lincoln was already dead and buried. Abraham Lincoln had a very, very close, loving relationship with a man, Joshua Speed, with whom he lived for 7 years and shared the same bed for 7 years. Now, when we hear that, we think, oh, gay. You know, and a lot of people, a lot of gays, understandably, want to claim Lincoln, and a lot of more straight-laced Lincoln fans want to reject that idea. The point is, sexuality had such a different meaning in those years. There wasn't the idea that you were either gay or straight wasn't part of, and that's very hard to get our minds around because we're so accustomed to thinking gay, straight, bi, whatever. You know, a lot of younger people today are giving us second thoughts by saying, oh, well, I reject the binary, I reject gay or straight, or I reject, you know, black or white or whatever. The fact is, in the 19th century, people didn't think, I don't believe, and most historians don't believe, that people thought in terms of sexual identity. People had sex. The people were well aware of that, and that sometimes it felt pretty good. But the notion that the sex of the person you had sex with identified you in some lasting way, that's something that Freud and others bring to our minds late in the 19th and on into the 20th century. So what interests me about Lincoln is the same thing that interests me about the men whose photographs I have from that same period. I don't think, unless there's some, you know, writing that hasn't surfaced anywhere, that where Lincoln and or Speed says to the other one, man, we had some hot sex last night. I mean, you know, we don't know. There's no way we can know that. We can know from some of their letters and whatever that those men really loved each other. But that doesn't necessarily, you know, as we all should know, no matter where or with whom we like to have sexual fulfillment. I mean, you know, sex and intimacy are not the same thing. Have you noticed? I mean, you know, you can have one without you can have a lot of one without any of the other. And when you have both, you know, you're in heaven. But that doesn't always go good. So that's my take on Lincoln. I mean, yeah. I think we're done, aren't we? I think we're done.
You can't read.
Thank you, Dan. Very much.
You want to go to the back to sign books?
Something here.
Leave it on, don't let that go away.